depends on how you define capitalism. Because different people, I have a Marxist definition of capitalism, but not everybody does. Some people think, the marketplace, buying and selling, not having the state telling you what to buy and how much to pay for it. That's capitalism. No, it's not. Capitalism is a system based on the private ownership of the essential means of production, and a system which is predicated on profit that comes out of surplus value, exploitation of labor, of wage labor, and markets. The whole point about the transition from feudalism to capitalism was that you had the process of commodification of land as a result of the enclosures, getting rid of the peasants, and commodification of labor. During feudalism, land and labor didn't have markets. Workers worked, but they couldn't quit, they didn't receive a wage, just that the feudal lord sent the sheriff over to collect rents from them. Okay? So markets and profits, the two pylons on which capitalism sits, both of them are now optional and actually a sideshow. Instead of profits, you have central bank money combined with cloud rents, the 40% of the price you pay on Amazon retained by Jeff Bezos. All the surpluses that private equity firms get. Remember, 3 companies, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, own 90% of all companies in the New York Stock Exchange. They don't make profits. They make rents. So you have rent replacing profit and Amazon.com-like companies, platforms, replacing markets. Amazon.com, Alibaba, Uber, they are not markets. They are platforms where trading takes place, buying and selling, outside the marketplace. They're like digital fiefdoms owned by a techno-feudal lord who collects rents. Remember, Uber doesn't have cars. In the same way that the landlord did not participate in production, he simply collected. That's what Uber does. That's what Airbnb does. That's what Amazon.com does. So if you replace the two pylons of capitalism with rent, cloud rent primarily, and digital platforms, and all that is founded on a foundation of cloud capital, what you end up is something which is not like capitalism. Now, we could have called it capitalism. I could have called the book Digital Capitalism. I could have called it Cloud Capitalism. I could have called it rentier capitalism. Some of my colleagues, like Guy Standing, call it rentier capitalism. But you see, I think it's important to ditch the word capitalism. Why? Because if this was the 1770s, and we were talking about the state of the world, what was going on then? Capitalism was already upending and undermining feudalism, taking over from feudalism. We could have called the new system, instead of calling it capitalism, we could have called it industrial feudalism. But that would have robbed us of the opportunity to concentrate our mind that this is a great transformation. This is not feudalism anymore. Even though it would have been technically correct to call it industrial feudalism or capital feudalism. For the same reason, I'm making the controversial claim that this is not capitalism anymore, even though it is a result of the triumph of capital.
Before we go to the next question, the thing about Amazon, I think can often be understated. People think, like you say, these aren't necessarily market transactions. It even goes beyond that to an extent. So for instance, I'm sure people watching and listening to this are familiar with the Amazon Basics range. Mm-hmm. You know, where you get a product which looks almost exactly the same as another one, but it's, 30% cheaper or whatever. Those products are created precisely because they have the analytics to look at the most profitable products with the best margins, with the highest volumes sold, the lowest customer returns. And they say, let's make exactly the same thing. So they don't just own the keys in terms of, can I enter, the town square to sell my goods and services? They also have data that the sellers don't have themselves.
Of course, that is the whole point.
It's incredible.
Same with Uber.
Yeah, incredible.
Now, why can't Uber drivers get together and create their own app? Well, they could. But that app would not have all the data that Uber has on you and me, and including their drivers. So it is this cloud capital, the algorithm, to put it this way, the algorithm, which creates the land, the digital land, where you must be in order to survive as a capitalist and therefore a vassal, or as a cloud serf. It's very different. It's profoundly different. But let me remind you that I'm not the first to hypothesize that if socialism as a project fails, we will end up with barbarism. Remember Rosa Luxemburg? The famous question from her prison cell, socialism or barbarism? It turns out that it is barbarism. And of course, it's very technologically advanced. It is based on huge quantities of capital. So capital has triumphed. And that answers the second part of your question. Of course, wherever you look, you come face to face with the triumph of capital, with the triumph of those who own capital, capitalists. But what I'm saying here is that in the end, it wasn't the left, the organized labor movement that upended capitalism. We used to think and hope that it would be labor that is the comeuppance of capitalism. But capitalism, remember what Marx said and Engels, capitalism creates its gravediggers, the proletariat, the organized laborers who will rise up and take possession of the means of production, capital, and put it to good use for society as a whole. It didn't happen, as you know, as we all know, unfortunately. But what happened was another construct, another product of capitalism did that job, and that other product was capital itself. So my hypothesis is that is that capital was so successful, like a very toxic virus, which kills off its host, and therefore it cannot propagate itself, like Ebola, which is a stupid virus, unlike COVID-19. COVID-19 killed very few people as a percentage of those who were infected, and therefore it spread and became a pandemic. Ebola never left particular villages in Africa because it killed all of them before it could spread. Capital developed a mutation of itself, which I call cloud capital, a particular form of capital, which has killed off capitalism, its host. That's my hypothesis. I know it's extremely controversial. Most of the people on the left do not like it at all, for two reasons. Firstly, because they think, hang on, it's not capitalism, but it's not socialism. How can that be? And the answer is Rosa Luxemburg, it's barbarism. And the second reason is because our task as socialists is now, if I'm right, is immensely harder. Because my point now is that you don't just have exploitation in the enterprise at the level of the firm, on the factory or the shop floor. You've got that continues, of course. It's the main spring of surplus value. It's the only spring of surplus value to this day. That has not changed from capitalism. But what has happened is, if you're Jeff Bezos, if you are the owner of Google, of Apple, if you're Elon Musk, then you own this new form of cloud capital, which allows you to extract from the rest of society, from proletarians, but from everyone else as well, huge quantities of rents and surpluses in a manner that reconstitutes a form of feudalism. The difference is that instead of the original feudalism, which is a system based on private ownership of land, which produces rent, now it's private ownership of the cloud, of cloud capital, because the cloud is capital, right? It's not some cloud up in the sky, which yields again a form of rent. Every time you buy something from Amazon.com, 40% of what you pay doesn't go to the capitalist who is selling you that stuff. It goes to Jeff Bezos. That's a cloud rent, and he is a new form of feudal lord. Thatcherism and Reaganism reached its crescendo with Blair here in this country and with Clinton in the United States. Effectively, the bankers were unshackled from all the constraints of the New Deal. The American New Deal and later the Clement Attlee and 1950s government's constraints on bankers. You see, governments had been burned once in 1929 because the Roaring Twenties were a period of unfettered financialization. The bankers, let's not forget, create money out of thin air. You know, people talk about the money tree in order to lambast socialists, but it is the bankers who have access to the money tree and they can pluck as much money from thin air as they want. And of course, when they overdo it, under the weight of all those mountains of money that they've created, they buckle under, and something like 1929 or 2008 happens. After 1929,
because a certain amount of people can't pay back liabilities, and all of a sudden the whole thing's
look, when
screwed.
all these leveraged bets, that is, bets based on borrowing from the future, not from other people, but from the future, thin air. When let's make this once again clear, that when Lloyds Bank or Barclays Bank give you a loan, they are not giving you money that somebody has saved. They are conjuring it up like magicians. So effectively, they type into your bank account, £10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 pounds. That money doesn't exist. It's out of thin air. Bankers have this right that is given to them by society, by you and me, by our listeners and audience. And then, of course, while these bets work out, if the borrowers manage to make this money and also make the money to pay interest, bankers are laughing all the way to their own bank.
Surprisingly, they're very profitable when it works like that.
Exactly. And then they think that they deserve the money. But then at some point, all that is needed is a small pinprick to deflate this or to burst that bubble. And then what happens is you and I, and especially the working class of our countries, bail them out. And more money printing by central banks. So after 2008, 2009, we had 35 trillion printed on behalf of bankers, $35 trillion. To put it in context, back in 2009, when that started, the total GDP income of the United States of America was 17, 18. So they printed 35. And they gave it to bankers. Now, bankers wanted to lend it to business people. Business people, however, looked around at the little people out there who were suffering under austerity, who were impecunious, who couldn't buy anything, as if they were going to invest it. So all this money that is being printed ends up inflating asset prices, artwork, house prices, and it never feeds into investment. That's why in Britain now you have this ridiculously low level of productivity because there's been no investment. And that's the same thing in the European Union. And the only entrepreneurs that care to take some of this liquidity and not just put it back to the stock exchange and instead use it to build up new capital are the tech lords. They took the money, and society, in other words, as a result of the inane handling by the establishment and the central banks of the 2008 crisis, effectively we have funded the build-up of masses of cloud capital. Cloud capital would always have been built, but not at that rate. Let me put it in terms of somebody who should know, McNamee, who wrote Zucked, a tech investor who was part of Facebook, one of the early investors in Facebook. He agrees with my assessment. He sent me an email recently saying so, that 9 out of the $10 that have been invested in what I call cloud capital came from central bank money.
That's extraordinary.
It's feudalism. Remember? The sovereign printed the money and the feudal lords used it together with their property rights over land to exploit the peasants and the vassals, which are today's capitalists who produce in the old-fashioned way using machinery, industrial robots, without cloud capital. And one last thing. If you want to understand the difference between Volkswagen and Tesla or Chinese cars, what happened in 1971, which I explained in the Global Minuto, thank you for mentioning, and I can see a copy of it back there.
We're well read here at Navarro Media.
I can see that. Well, thank you for that. The story I tell in that book is that after the Second World War, the United States created a centrally planned capitalist global economy. Centrally planned. Because if you think about it, it's very difficult for young people today to wrap their minds around that. Between 1944 and 1971, 72, 73, we had fixed exchange rates. That is, you would never open the newspaper and try to find out what the exchange rate between the pound and the French franc, the pound and the US dollar was. It was fixed for years. I mean, I grew up in a world where there were 30 drachmas to a dollar forever. Interest rates were fixed. Can you imagine a world where interest rates were not exactly fixed, but more or less around 4%. You knew that, if you borrowed money, you would be paying 4% forever. But that's like a centrally planned gospel and Soviet economy, more or less, without common ownership of the means of production. But it was planned. The only way that could work was if all these currencies were effectively based on the US dollar. So we had the dollar in different guises. But the only way we could have the dollar in different guises was that if the United States was a surplus country. Because if it was a surplus, while it was a surplus country after the Second World War, it was the only country that had a trade surplus. Every time they sold a jet or a car or a washing machine to a Brit, to a French person, to a German person, a quantity of dollars would go to the United States. So the United States would give us dollars, dollarize us, Marshall Aid, for instance, other ways as well. Same to Japan. And then by selling us their wares, we would return the dollars and that would complete the recycling loop. But for that to happen, they had to have a trade surplus. After 1968-69, they had a trade deficit, which means that they were leaking dollars. Dollars were a net stream or torrent of dollars was coming to Europe and to Japan. At some point, those who held the dollars, Germans, Brits, Saudi Arabians, Japanese, started worrying that they wouldn't be able to buy as much gold with the dollars because there was this increasing quantity of dollars. And that meant that the fixed exchange rate regime had to break down. And it broke down. And the Americans, instead of being yet another empire that lost its power, its political power, its military power, its hegemonic power, as a result of going into the red, managed, and it's the only empire that has ever managed that, to become more hegemonic by using their trade deficit in the way that I described before, to ensure that the Japanese, British, Dutch, German, French, Italian, and later Chinese capitalists needed the American trade deficit as a source of demand for their net exports to the United States. And this is the world that they just shifted. And it was a part of what I call in the book a dark deal. So the dark deal between Washington, D.C. and the Chinese Communist Party was, okay, we will send you over our machinery, our industry. You will produce the stuff. We will keep the IP, the intellectual property rights, in the case of Apple. So we will get a large share of the monopoly profits from selling iPhones, but you will keep the share, you'll keep the surplus value that you extract from your Chinese proletariat. You will be paid in dollars, which of course we mint as a deficit country, so they are worthless unless you send them back to Washington, and you will finance our government, and you will get an interest rate from the bonds, the treasury bills that you will buy. At the same time, you buy real estate. We will not let you buy companies unless they are useless and not particular. So you can't buy Google, you can't buy Bank of America. That's the same deal as they were given to the Japanese in the 1960s. That is the deal that enriched Chinese capitalists and American rentiers at the expense of the American working class. People talk about the dominance of the dollar, and they assume that it's a good thing for the United States. It isn't. The dominance of the dollar is fantastic for American rentiers, and for Chinese capitalists, and Japanese capitalists, and German capitalists. And the people who actually suffer the most as a result of the exorbitant privilege of the dollar is the American working class, which was serially abandoned by the Democratic Party. And politics hates a vacuum. Donald Trump waltzed in and took it.
And I suppose people, just quickly on that, people might say, oh, well, we know that low-income earners vote Democrat, etc. Obviously, that's highly stratified on racial lines. But in those states where Trump gets over the line in 2016, former heavily industrialized states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, that is precisely the story. And I think even now, 7 years later, it's very hard for the left to understand that it was former blue-collar workers, many in trade unions, who took Donald Trump to the White House. They may do again. I mean, who knows? It's a different world now. But, I think they might do again. You say something as well, building on this, which is the worst thing you want as a Chinese capitalist is for yuan to be the
dominant currency.
The global currency replacing the dollar,
right.
Which is quite funny because when people say it's the end of the dollar, China is, heading towards hegemony status, blah, blah, blah. Well, no, actually, if you're a Chinese exporter, that's a terrible thing to be.
Indeed, or a German exporter. Why do you think the euro never competed with the dollar for supremacy? Because the German capitalists would hate that. Why do you think we have no Eurobond? Because the lack of a Eurobond guarantees that the euro will never compete with the dollar. So German industrial capital does not want a Eurobond, doesn't care so much about, fiscal union and so on. It just doesn't want to lose access to the American trade deficit, which is the reason why they're, amassing all this surplus value. So we must stop thinking in football terms. My nation against the other nation. England versus Argentina. It's not that. The division is within our countries. It's between the capitalist class in China.
This isn't in my notes, but can I ask you a question about the euro? Because the argument you're making about Eurobonds is really interesting. I have always been a critic of the euro. And I cannot understand why an Italian or a French leftist supports the euro, because the whole euro project, as I understand it, basically the sort of political economy of the eurozone seems to be premised upon the idea of, well, basically it's for German exporters. It's destroyed two historically powerful, manufacturer exporter oriented countries, particularly Italy. Italy is a share, the size of the economy, its share of proportionate rather to the size of its economy, its manufacturing base was about the same as Germany's, even as recently as sort of 10, 15 years ago, before 2008. And it seems obvious to me that membership of the Eurozone means permanent decline for Italians, permanent decline for Italy's productive
permanent
base.
austerity.
Yeah, permanent austerity, permanent. And this is a G7 economy or G8 economy. Same for France, to a slightly lesser extent. And yet there aren't major movements in either country to leave the euro. I find it extraordinary. Now, I know there's huge downsides to leaving the euro. It'd be very painful. But the fact that's not even in the conversation in both nations is perplexing for me.
It was in the conversation, but it was killed off. Let me explain what the lure of the euro was for progressive people who were not sellouts, turncoats. Because the turncoats, we know why they wanted the euro. I have this memory of the 1970s when Greek trade unions would go on strike to gain some pay rise. Strikes are always extremely painful. There's a lot of sacrifice. Usually the strikers are never compensated. It's the strike breakers who get compensated because they get the pay rise even though they have not suffered any of the costs of the strike. And the next day, or 5 days after securing a 5%, let's say, wage increase, the Bank of Greece would devalue the drachma and they would lose it all. So the notion of a currency that cannot be devalued was very attractive even to trade unions. What they did not factor in was that there was a price to pay for that. And the price was that there would be internal devaluation, that they would, not find one morning that their currency, the money they had in their wallet, was devalued as a result of an action of the Bank of Greece, but they would never get a pay rise. Indeed, they would get pay cuts. Don't forget that average wages today in Greece are 35% lower. 35% lower in nominal terms, not in absolute terms, than they were in 2007.
That's crazy.
Similarly with pensions. So that they didn't factor in. Once you get trapped into the Eurozone, it's like being in a house which is on fire but has no fire exits. You need to demolish the walls to get out. You put it very nicely when you said that the costs are very large, because this is exactly how it's been designed, to make the costs very large. You know that when we entered the Eurozone, our printing presses were destroyed. Did you know that?
No.
It was part of the deal.
No.
It was part of the deal. You have to dismantle and destroy
your national mint.
Like the IRA had to destroy its weapons as part of the Good Friday Agreement, we had to destroy our printing presses as we entered the Eurozone. Now, somehow, I don't believe that the Bundesbank, the Germans, destroyed their printing presses. But we certainly did, and so did the Italians.
That's extraordinary. And what you just said there about nominal, I mean, just for people to understand, nominal means, look, we're not talking about inflation or what you can buy. No. We're literally talking about the currency.
Yeah.
And I saw a statistic recently about the purchasing power of 18 to 35-year-old Italians. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like 50.
It's declined precipitously since the 1990s.
Yeah, I think it's basically 50% what it was 20 years ago.
Yes.
And you think, you only get to live once.
But that's why we have a neo-fascist in government.
Well, quite, exactly. Yeah. Of course people are going to be angry.
That's why the Socialist Party died. That's why the Communist Party doesn't exist, because it accepted this process. And the only voices that are supported by the public in Italy are the ones who remain anti-establishment, unfortunately, as descendants of Mussolini.
I mean, I understand why people are angry. I do understand why they turn to the far right, because you only get one shot at life. You're around for 70, 80 years, and there is a political settlement which is screwing you over so badly. It's depriving you of the life you expected, which you deserve, and nobody in the political class is doing anything about it.
Don't forget the other great danger for countries like Italy and Greece. Emigration. Not immigration. Emigration. The problem is not that the Africans are coming. The problem is that the Greeks and the Italians are leaving. Europe is over. I was chatting with Andres Manuel, the president of Mexico, a few months ago. And we had this conversation. And he said, Yanis, look, as a Mexican, I'm closer to Europe than I am to the United States. Culturally, spiritually, politically, ideologically. But Europe is irrelevant to us. It's a BRICS, China, in other words, not the BRICS. The only thing that matters from the BRICS is the sea. China and our huge neighbor north of our border. And I see this wherever I go. And it makes perfect sense. Look, Aaron, let's just for a moment imagine with great hope that there is a peace process that starts for Ukraine tomorrow. And there's a big table somewhere in the UN, Geneva, wherever. We know who will represent Ukraine, Zelensky, Russia, Putin, America, Biden, China, Xi, India, Modi. Who's going to represent Europe? You just ask yourself that question and then suddenly you realize how irrelevant Europe is. Because it used to be Merkel. Merkel had the political power and clout to do it. Scholz doesn't. Macron doesn't. Why? Not only because they are pipsqueaks compared to Merkel, they are, but because anything they say will be vetoed by the government of Poland, the government of Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, who considered them to be Putin's handmaidens, both Scholz and Macron. I'm not passing value judgment, I'm simply describing. So the two countries that will have to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine will not be allowed to represent the European Union in these negotiations. And so who will? Von der Leyen. I mean, she's only there because she failed as a minister in Merkel's cabinet, and Merkel wanted to get rid of her and sent her to Brussels, because in Brussels you can't hear them scream. Remember the line from Borgen? So Europe is politically, this political paralysis reflects the fact that we don't have any cloud capital.
Yeah, and I would add as well, Europe's demographic pyramid is a nightmare. I mean, China's isn't great, but Europe's is a nightmare, if you include obviously the East and Central Europe. Energy resources. Yeah,
but you know, that's I insist.
Cloud capital, geography.
It is cloud capital, nothing else. Everything else we could have gotten out of. If you don't have a competitor to Google, a competitor to Uber, a competitor to Facebook, a competitor to Apple, a competitor to Amazon.com, if every German or Italian or French or British producer has to go through those cloud lists in order to sell their stuff, even in Europe, and, you know,